If you're listening to this episode when it comes out, you may know that the story behind book will be released in a few days on October 15th. In the spirit of that, I'll be doing a few episodes revolving around books. The topic of today's episode seemed almost too easy to cover since the invention was something I think we all remember learning about in grammar school. But as per usual with this podcast and the book, whenever I dig a little deeper, I always find out new information that wasn't in my history books. While those books were most likely printed using modern-day printers, there wouldn't even be widespread use of books without today's topic in the first place. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind the printing press. Instead of a book update right now, I'll be releasing a separate episode with a book update, plus a sneak peek into the book's acknowledgments section, because I really want to thank everyone, not just in the book, but also in the podcast. So check your podcast app, and the show notes for this episode will have the link to that. Though we credit Johann Gutenberg's printing press with making it possible to create multiple copies of books and text, the precursor to this was block printing. About 600 years before Gutenberg, Chinese monks would carve wooden blocks with characters and illustrations, then coat the blocks in ink and press them onto paper. The Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text, is one of the earliest books printed this way that is still in existence. It wasn't discovered until 1900 and is now in the British Library in London. Wood and metal carvings were used throughout China as well as Japan and Korea from the 9th century on. In the 11th century, a Chinese peasant named Pi Sheng created the precursor to Gutenberg's movable type. He produced hundreds of individual characters out of baked clay. The difference between this and the blocks was that these characters could be sorted and arranged individually and reused, instead of an entire block carved by hand that would erode over time, meaning the whole block would have to be redone, rather than individual characters. But this method was slow to catch on. In the following centuries, the clay and wood being used for these characters was replaced with metal, such as bronze and tin. So why do we credit Gutenberg for the printing press and movable type then, if Sheng was the real innovator? It actually has to do with language. You may have been surprised when I said that movable type didn't catch on quickly in China, Japan, and Korea. But the languages used were known as logographical, meaning graphics are used to represent words instead of letters like in Western languages. When Johann Gutenberg inventing the printing press, those speaking Germanic, Romantic, or Latin-based languages only needed about 25 letters made for the press, whereas logographical languages used hundreds of different characters. Before the printing press, however, most European books and literature were printed either by hand by scribes or using the wood block techniques. The process for creating a book was long and arduous. Scribes would copy books by hand carefully. And there wasn't correction fluid yet, so if the scribe made a mistake, the whole page would have to be restarted from the very beginning. By the way, if you're wondering about the origin of correction fluid, it's one of the chapters in the story behind book. But that's a whole other story. Now, this sounds like a lot of work for a book, but in Gutenberg's time, books were only found in monasteries, libraries, educational facilities, or in the homes of rich people. Only about 10% of Europe was literate anyway. The most common book to own, though, was the Bible, which many families passed down to future generations, and was used to record births and deaths as sort of a family tree. But the printing press changed all that, but not before its inventor found himself in a desperate need to make money. You may have learned about Gutenberg in history class, but those who have researched his life actually don't have a lot to go on. But what historians do know about him and his life were mostly gleaned from financial records and lawsuits. Gutenberg began his working years as a gem cutter and polisher. He also worked at the mint, so he knew his way around metalworking, which would come in handy for producing movable type. The trend emerged in the 1400s of pilgrims traveling to Holy Lands and using mirrors to supposedly capture rays from religious artifacts and relics. The mirrors were then covered, only to be revealed again when the rays were needed for the healing of family and farm animals. Seeing the potential for profit, Gutenberg went in with 2 colleagues to create these mirrors. However, they had trouble making a profit because they miscalculated the date of the next pilgrimage. They were early by about a year. This meant a whole year would have to pass before the trio could get their money back. During that time, one of the partners died in the Black Plague shortly after a contract was made with a clause that said if a partner died, his heir wouldn't replace him, but instead would be rewarded financially. When the brother of the deceased sued Gutenberg, the records for that lawsuit mention a project Gutenberg had referred to as an, quote, adventure and art. It involved a wooden press with movable type. Gutenberg lost the lawsuit and the wooden press he was working on. But 2 years later, he moved to Mainz, Germany, and borrowed money to work more on his idea for a press. His new prototypes were capable of producing small books and a calendar that have been attributed to him. It wasn't until he borrowed 800 guilders, which is about 700,000 American dollars now, from a financier named Johann Faust, that he was able to fund the construction of a workshop large enough to accommodate the equipment needed to print the 42-line Bible he's known for. It became known as the Gutenberg Bible. Although his invention was innovative, time-saving, and cut printing costs down considerably, he continued to need more money for bigger and more ambitious printing projects, and asked for another 800 guilders. He still wanted his books and Bibles to be of the utmost quality and style. But Fust, who lent him the money to produce his Bibles, demanded repayment with interest toward the end of the lengthy Bible printing project. But Gutenberg couldn't pay, and Fust ended up taking him to court. Depending on the source, Fust is seen in one of two ways, either as a dastardly miser intent on robbing Gutenberg of everything he had accomplished, including his equipment, which Fust used to take over Gutenberg's business. Or Fust was seen as the victim, and he was the rich sap Gutenberg kept squeezing for money for his extravagant ideas. In fact, Gutenberg made his Bibles only available through pre-order at 30 guilders apiece. Only 180 were set to be made, but that still would have been enough to pay Fust back. It's even been suggested that Fust, which is spelled F-U-S-T, was the bassist on whom the legend of Faust was based. Here's a little tangent I found fascinating. Once Fust was in control of Gutenberg's printing press and had the Bibles in his possession, he took a portion of them to Paris to sell them at a similar price as the Bibles that were printed using traditional printing methods. It's said that those who bought his Bibles began comparing them and became suspicious of how identical their copies were, and they questioned how Fust could have produced such a great number of them so quickly. Fust had kept the printing press a secret up till then, so the buyers instead chose to believe that Fust had practiced witchcraft to make these Bibles, and had clearly signed a pact with the devil. Although Gutenberg was able to use his invention on a smaller level throughout the rest of his life, nothing he did came close to matching the success of the 42-line Bible. But one thing to note about his invention that harkens back to the previous episode about banned books was before the printing press, it was very easy for authorities to censor books and destroy the dozen or so copies in existence. But as technology advanced, so did the speed books were produced. In fact, the number of books produced in an entire year during the 15th and 16th centuries now takes a mere seconds to produce. Information for this episode was sourced from Live Science, Biography, the University of Texas at Austin, where you can find a digital copy of one of Gutenberg's original Bibles, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. This week on Trivia Tuesday in the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook, we had a post from Jason Bryant from Matt Talk Online who shared a post he wrote about college nicknames, which was full of trivia. So take a look in the group where it's posted, and the link is also in the show notes. Adam posted Apollo astronauts left 96 bags of bodily waste on the moon to make room for all the moon dust and rock samples they were bringing back to Earth. Brett posted, as sure as Kilimanjaro rises like Olympus above the Serengeti, sang Toto in a very awkwardly phrased song line. But that's not all that's wrong. Kilimanjaro doesn't rise from the Serengeti, and Olympus is half the height of Kilimanjaro. Now, you guys know I love Africa by Toto, so the song can do no wrong in my book, even though I remember learning this fact because the band members had never actually traveled to Africa at the time the song was written. Luke posted, a moment is officially defined as 90 seconds. Matt posted the original Where's Waldo book was challenged and banned a lot between 1990 and 1999. Apparently, if you look really, really close at a beach scene, you can see a certain side of a lady part that measures 1/16 of an inch. He found this out on the podcast Your Brain on Facts, which also covered banned books in a double episode during Banned Books Week at the end of September. If you'd like to talk about trivia you pick up during the week and have it read on the show, join the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook. This episode was brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind. And a big thank you to new executive producers Jeffrey S. and Podcast We Listen To, as well as ongoing executive producers Dan Gallagher, Jonathan Bloom, Ryan P. Jackson, Barry G. and Andrew Scott, Jared Denham, Linguist Sam, Epic Film Guy Nick, Ryle Davis Jr., Dave Jackson, Sunshine and Power Cuts, Everyone Has a Podcast, Adam Higgins, The Beardcaster, Eliquity, Jim Collison, North Omaha History Podcast, Dan Brennick, Two Peas on a Podcast, Jason Bryant, History Goes Bump, The One Word Go Show, and Stargate Pioneer. Thanks for listening.